welcome to episode 4 of Audio Basics. I'm Tom Martin. I'm the executive publisher of the Next Screen Network, which includes The Absolute Sound, Hi-Fi Plus, and Winding Road. I'm here with Lance Profit, who's the assistant publisher of the Next Screen Network, and we're going to entertain you today. Hopefully Lance isn't going to punch me out. I doubt that he will. I signed the paycheck, so
yeah, exactly.
It's probably bad form. Anyway, in this episode, we're going to cover the last 4 of the top 10 elements you can use to judge sound quality. They're really things you're looking for if you're shopping for a stereo at kind of the fundamental level. In the audio world, there is a lot of detail and there are a lot of very specific things, so we'll eventually in future episodes talk about other things, but today we're going to talk about the final 4 elements, which are dynamic capability, resolution and noise floor, that's one item, timing, and distortion. So, without further ado, are you ready for this, Lance?
I'm ready. I got my notepad here. I'm ready to take some notes. Yeah.
Cool. So let's first talk about dynamic capability, which probably sounds pretty straightforward. I hope it is. But music, since we've been talking a lot about different instruments, and we've been talking about resonance, and we've been talking about overtone, and we've been talking about sound staging, one of the fundamental characteristics about music, which is like almost so obvious you don't think about it is dynamic. It's kind of what gives music life. So sometimes it's soft, and sometimes it's loud. And we'll see how Nikon did with the automatic level control there, but you know what I mean. It goes from soft to loud, and sometimes very rapidly, sometimes it builds up over time, but there's a dynamic element to music that is part of what we really enjoy. I know Lance is a fan of, I don't even know what you call it, metal?
Hard rock, yeah.
Hard rock.
There's levels to the metal game. I'm not
you're
too
not,
hardcore in it.
You're not too hardcore there. Okay. Anyway, but in hard rock, there's definitely quite a bit of room for dynamics. At the same time, there's a lot of music. I guess I'm not really a metal guy, so I don't exactly know what I'm talking about, but there's certainly some loud music that kind of isn't that dynamic because people are just churning away, wailing on their strats and pounding on their drums and doing the stuff that they do. But since, as we've said from the beginning, we want to use the intention of the artist and the sound of the music as it would have been performed in a live venue as the reference for judging sound quality, because we assume we want to hear what the artist originally had in mind. So since we're trying for high fidelity to what we call the absolute sound, the sound of live music in a real space, since music has dynamic capabilities from soft touches on the piano to full-on what the orchestral people call tutti, just wailing away, we want to capture that dynamic capability. Pretty simple and straightforward, but probably one of the most important things that distinguishes a mediocre or inferior stereo system from a really, really good one. I will say one little thing about equipment. We've tried to stay away from equipment here, but the capability to produce dynamics, especially rim shots, percussive sounds, takes way more power than you would think. Potentially thousands of watts per channel to really nail the reproduction of dynamics. So I mention that not because you need to necessarily have 1,000 watts per channel, but that there's a lot of room to get better and better and better at dynamics, and that's even true with music that per se doesn't seem exactly like it's loud.
So now when you've mentioned like the loudness of the music itself, and you've mentioned potentially thousands of watts per channel, are we talking, does dynamic capability, is that direct correlation to how loud? Is it loudness?
Yes and no. So it's a really good question. So we think a way to describe this is to think about the average loudness level and the peak loudness level. So you can imagine that if I was playing along on my piano, do 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 do, and suddenly, and I'm using piano as an example just because you can kind of imagine there being a keyboard here, but I'm playing along, do 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 do, and then suddenly the music calls for me to go from, PPP on the score to FFF, which is full on, and I start, pounding away on the keyboard, right? Mm-hmm. The average level might actually be quite low because it's mostly soft, gentle sounds. And what I'm looking for as a composer is I go to that full forte sound to catch your attention and be dynamic and interesting and contrasty. And so the average level might be low, but the peak, when I really go at it, might take super high power. So it's loudness in the sense that the peak will be loud, but what I'm really trying for is the ability to show contrast, because that's what makes, generally, what many artists are trying to put into the music to make it interesting. If it's all the same all the time, then it gets a little bit boring. You've probably noticed in concerts, for example, the band will generally not program all fast rockers. They'll open with a fast rocker to get the audience going and have it, and it's often a well-known song, and then they'll do a ballad, and then they'll do a mid-paced one, and they vary the pace the same way. A story isn't all guns and drama. I mean, there might be some, but there's you open with a car chase and there's a car flying off of a bridge, and then there's some development of the characters where we understand the backstory behind how the guy ended up in a car that he's driving off of a bridge because he was robbing a bank and something went, there's a story. We're telling a story, and the story isn't told all with cars flying off of a bridge, because at some point,
so like the dynamic capability, it's the ability to, like, when you hit that power notes, the whole band
going crazy, the contrast.
So which means, in layman's terms, like the mentally digestible, okay, that's clear, I understood what they did, as opposed to maxing out your system to just
to play loud.
Yeah, okay.
Right.
Gotcha.
And the other thing about just the sheer ability to do high average power levels is you might lose the ability to have dynamic contrast. Because if you're playing the do really loud do, how much louder can you go? Right? I've probably blown your eardrums out twice already, but so I won't do it again. But there's a limit to how loud my voice can go.
Yeah.
So if I'm always at a loud level, then I can't put any emphasis on it. And we emphasize things with volume. We can also emphasize things by talking very softly. I had a teacher in high school, a physics teacher, and he would very frequently get the attention of the class by building up to a key point and then getting softer. F equals M.
At least he wasn't like that all the time, so you're just falling asleep throughout the
Yeah,
class. It's
no,
like,
and that's why you want dynamic contrast,
exactly, yeah.
right? You want the thing to be propelled along. So dynamic capability is very important for music because for the artist to tell a story, the artist has to use dynamics, and the stereo system has to be able to reproduce those. And yes, a peak will be loud, but it's not really about the sheer ability to play at nosebleed levels. By the way, generally we would recommend for the protection of your hearing not to play your stereo super loud. And we're going to get on to the next characteristic, which is, in addition to dynamic capability, we want resolution. And one of the beauties to tie these things together of a high resolution system is you don't have to play it as loud for you to be able to get a feel for how the music sounds. We've seen the opposite a number of times where you have a system that's got low resolution, and to hear, remember we talked about overtones in the prior episode, to hear the overtones and the sense of the hall, you feel like you have to crank it up, so you end up playing it louder than you really want to, and louder than it might have been played originally. It's really interesting to go to the concert hall and hear classical music reproduced and realize how it's often softer than you play your stereo. Because you're playing your stereo to try to get resolution, detail. You're trying to hear the total shape of the sound of the instruments. And the less resolution you have, the louder you have to play it to get those soft tones, to try to get them to come out. And sometimes they just aren't there. Sometimes they're lost in, the one way to think about this is we package resolution and noise floor together, because you can imagine if there's a very soft sound and you were listening to your audio system in your car, you might have a hard time hearing those really soft sounds because the car is much noisier than your home. We measure volume on a decibel scale. So loud is, let's say, 100 decibels. Jet engine at, I forget the distance, but outside, somewhat near a jet engine is like 120 or 130 dB. That's super danger territory. Damage occurs to your hearing in maybe a few seconds, so you don't even want to go there. But I would say what we normally would consider loud music is something in the 100 dB range.
Which, by the way, I'm sorry to bring it up again. It's not like I'm obsessed with AC/DC, but those two guys, they actually have. I wonder if the dementia is because of they're deaf. They're like they're used to playing in front of these stacks for like years.
I'm not a doctor, but there definitely is a relationship between hearing loss and dementia. I'm not saying it's one-to-one.
Stay tuned for episode 20 where we dive into where audio goes wrong.
Yeah. But if you imagine listening to a song in your car, if we use the decibel scale where 100 is loud and something like 50 dB is quite soft, so the ambient noise level, when we just don't talk, the ambient noise level in a typical residential environment might be 45 dB, 40 dB. I don't remember exactly, but it's a number like that. A car rolling down the road has a background noise level of 70 or 75 dB. You can imagine then if I had sounds that were in the 55 or 60 dB range, they would be perfectly audible in a home environment because they're 10 or 15 dB louder than the ambient environment. But in a car, they might be 10 or 20 dB lower than the noise level, and you just can't, they're just part of the noise. And you can't hear them. So again, back to the overtones we talked about, the decay in the concert environment, the decay of sounds in the concert environment, you can imagine that though if we had a high noise level, that would make those sounds not hearable, and we would lose the ability to get the sense of what the instrument really sounded like, or we would lose the ability to sense the spaciousness of the sound in the environment. Now, I just talked about noise in the environment, in the car or in your room at home or wherever it might be. On an airplane is another really good example of, I guarantee you a modern jet is louder than your car. Well, I don't know. I know what you do driving, so your car may sound like a jet. But anyway, a normal...
He's talking about my Porsche 911. It's okay, don't worry.
yeah. There you go. But the stereo system itself has a noise level. And so you can imagine that if its noise level is such that it loses the very, very finest tones, then the resolution would effectively be lower. It might actually be playing the signal down at a very, very, very small level, but if it gets buried in the noise, then you don't hear it. And in effect, the stereo has lower resolution, a lower ability to convey the details of the instrumental sounds, the overtones, what it sounds like to pluck the guitar.
But how do you know, like, if you have it? Like, what are you listening? You've just described, like, what you're listening for, but how do you know if it's good? You know
really,
what I mean? Like,
excellent question. So I start with, unfortunately, homework, which is actually spending some time listening to what real instruments sound like. And then when you listen to it on a stereo, I think you will know that almost all stereos, even really good ones, are an approximation of what that real instrument sounds like. Sometimes it's a super good approximation, and you're like, whoa. And sometimes it's like, okay. I mean, I know it's a guitar. I might even, of course, I probably can clearly hear that it's an acoustic guitar versus an electric guitar, but I know somehow it doesn't sound real. And then I hear a better stereo with more detail, and I'm like, ooh, that sounds like I wiped some goo off of my glasses. Neither of us are wearing glasses right now, but you know what I mean. I turned on the windshield wipers. It's just clearer. The detail I can see, or hear in this case, is just better and more like what I know the sound of the real instrument.
Makes sense. So it's just it's almost like a muscle memory in a sense that, like, you have to, obviously you hear the real instrument. We know it's never quite that, but you really need to compare against other stereos almost to see where you're at.
Yeah, and then when you hear other stereos, you will start to notice, oh, yeah, that one, okay, pretty good. That one, okay, really good. That one, oh, it's just like a completely clear sheet of glass, or it's like air, right? I've seen clear glass where you're like, wow, that's really nice. But if you step outside, it's
dog
even
that
nicer.
runs into the glass door or something.
Yeah,
or even the people, right?
That stuff can happen for sure. And really, even though I'm talking about like studying the sound of instruments and so on, which I highly recommend and is a very good thing to do, you don't have to go that far. I claim you know this. I claim when I play a stereo that has got mediocre resolution, you're like, okay, that sounds nice. And if it's got good frequency balance and decent stereo width, you'll be like, oh, that's a good stereo. And then when you hear a great stereo, you'll immediately know it's a more detailed, resolved presentation that sounds more real.
Makes sense.
Of
course, for sure.
Like your muscle memory point, you will know because you've spent your entire life listening to sounds. Think of the total number of sounds you've heard. I mean, real sounds. And one of the reasons that people love, for the resolution kinds of things I'm talking about, to use female voice is we almost all have a pretty good idea of what female voices sound like because we've listened to our mothers and our friends and business colleagues and whoever it might be, and we kind of know what those things sound like in real life. And there you go.
Yeah.
All right. So that's dynamic capability, and resolution is kind of the other end, really, of how we think about dynamic capability. We tend to think about dynamics as being able to go, rim shot, peak sound. We think of resolution, which is really just dynamic capability by another word, as being able to go do very fine sounds well and properly. Now let's talk about the final two dimensions. And the next one is a slightly tricky one to understand, and yet I guarantee you when you hear it, you will know it right away. And that is a parameter that's called timing. So music, as those of you who studied it will know, music is written on in scores on tablature with notes, and those notes specify times when the note is to be played and how long the note is to be held. So timing is actually fundamental to music. And if I were a musician, I would whip out my piano or my Stratocaster or something now and play you a song and screw up the timing, and you would immediately know.
Yeah, it's the difference between amateur and pro bands. It's like
Totally.
The amateurs can be, I want to say, great musicians in their own right, but it's not that precision timing. That it's just like, these guys are pros.
There are stories after story after story of bands that were good songwriters, and they got to the studio, and there was one band member, frequently the drummer, because he's in charge of timing, who really wasn't at the pro level. And it's one of the reasons that there's a whole cadre of studio musicians who know exactly what they're doing, and a lot of their expertise is in being able to play to time very precisely, because the producers of the recordings know that you can hear when the time is off. And again, just like dynamics bring life to the proceedings, time also gives life to it. And when you play something, when you slow it down, there's a band, actually, it's an interesting one to check out, who plays with time to really change the character of songs. They're artists at doing it, but the band's called Cowboy Junkies.
Okay.
And they'll take a song and slow it down by half. And it completely changes how the song sounds. Open up Spotify or Tidal or whatever you use for streaming and try it out. But look up Cowboy Junkies. I highly recommend their first album.
Is it original music, or they take covers and
I
mess with
think they do quite a few covers. I think some of it's original. I don't remember because it's, 30 years ago or something.
Some of these covers, though, are so original in their own right.
Yeah.
Like, I was listening to Cake War Pigs, so Black Sabbath War Pigs. They mess with the timing a bit, but there's a lot of horns in it. They redo the song amazing. I think it's awesome. So, I'll definitely check those guys out.
So time matters, and I'm suggesting with Cowboy Junkies, you can change timing and come up with a really, like you're saying, pretty much a different song. But if you mess up the timing, then it's just, you will know. And what a stereo can do is a stereo can't, if it's operating properly, a stereo isn't going to change the time signature or anything dramatic like that, but it still can make it a little bit off sounding.
Well,
And
you did warn me. I at one point had a 5.1 system all at the front, and you warned me that the timing, because of the what would have been satellite speakers, the timing is that's. But going back to what a 2-channel system, as long as it's set up properly, it won't particularly mess up the timing. But
and yet it will. So here's a really good example. Bass, when it's reproduced in a room, remember we said the instrument resonates, and that's how it makes its characteristic sound. Bass in a room will have a decay time. We don't want it to be long, but in many real rooms, the decay time of what the stereo is reproducing will be longer than it should be, and that makes the bass note kind of hang on for 100, 200, 500 milliseconds, that's half a second, and it slows down the feeling of the song.
Interesting.
So now if you have, a million note per second guitar player, Joe Satriani, for example, okay? Get the album Surfing with the Alien, and Joe plays, I don't honestly know how he does it, because I'm pretty sure it's like one guitar, not overdubbed.
Yeah, he's crazy.
He's just crazy dude, but you can't take music like that and then have the bass just plodding along with boom. It just is out of character with the music. And so the stereo can effectively slow things down, particularly in the bass, by the way the sound is reproduced in the room. And timing is so important that these little defects in how time is reproduced can throw off the feeling of the whole track that you're playing and make it be like, okay, it's usually the difference between great and good, or the difference between good and okay. We're usually, despite your 5.1 wall of sound system, we're usually not talking about going from great to terrible. But if you're going to pay good money for hi-fi equipment and you want your music reproduced well, then you don't want merely good, you want great. And
so how do you know if you have that?
So I particularly like to listen to percussion because the kick drum and the synchronization of the kick drum with bass is often what drives the music along in a song. And if you listen to two different stereos, I think you will hear very frequently that one of them sounds rhythmic and alive and tight, and one of them sounds a little slow. You might not literally think about it as slow, it might sound heavy, but it just doesn't have that groove.
Yeah.
It's less groove driven on songs that need that, and I think you can hear that.
Now, does this apply to like 2.1 systems? Like, are you talking sub, or are you talking the main speakers, just bass in general, right? Like,
yes, and yes.
Okay.
So with a subwoofer, the issues are often amplified. I don't mean literally, although that to some degree is true, because a lot of systems with a subwoofer have the subwoofer turned up too high. That's not a requirement of there being a subwoofer. That's just a fact of how they're often set up. And by turning them up too high, you now have a little bit too much bass, and the bass tends to be moving along kind of slowly, and it's the low bass which has a sort of slow feel to it, and then you're exciting those room resonances that I talked about before. So now there's some extra decay in there and so on. But you could have a regular, just 2-speaker setup that had the same problem. There's no reason you couldn't have the same problem. So it could be a regular 2-channel, could be 2.1. So in a way, I'm talking about bass in general being the hardest part of the timing problems.
Okay.
There are timing problems theoretically at any frequency, and if we were really to get into the detail when we talk in episode 441 about D to A conversion, there's a lot in the digital realm where things happen based on timing that isn't literally the timing you hear, but it affects the ultimate sound that's produced. So time is just, it's the dimension we live with time, but we don't think about it in terms of how to evaluate a stereo. So I really wanted to get it on the table here because we're going to talk about it in various contexts, but you especially notice it in the bass, I think.
Okay.
Okay. All right. So that leaves us with the 10th and final quality of these top 10 aspects of how to judge whether a stereo is good. And that is one that really we could paper across all of these, which is distortion. But what I want to highlight here is the kind of distortion that is additive. So we're adding something to the sound that wasn't originally there, or we're subtracting something from the sound that is there. And I think you can understand if we want to reproduce the original sound accurately, then we can't be adding to it. That wouldn't be accurate. And we can't be subtracting from it. That wouldn't be accurate either. So distortion is kind of the 10th factor that becomes important. The funny thing about distortion is you often don't hear it as literally like you would if you took a Marshall stack and flipped it into overdrive mode. You know, if you had a tube amplifier and you just overdrove it, you get that
we love that distortion.
kind of distortion sound. And in most good hi-fi equipment, the distortion level just isn't high enough that you hear it literally like distortion. It kind of comes across in a similar way to what I was talking about with noise. It's a thing that's there, like I used the example of the car, but like the background noise in your car, or background noise in a room, or background noise in an airplane. Mm-hmm. It's there, and it makes it harder to hear the delicate, nuanced sounds.
So, like, one thing I've heard is, and I don't know if you want to go into detail on this now or if that's another episode, but tube amps add an element of good distortion. I know you just said not to add something, and I don't know how true that is. But
Okay, so I mentioned this earlier when I was talking about the overtones in the last episode, and I said how the ear tends to, these are generalizations, so let's be careful, but tends to interpret even harmonics to 2 times multiple and the 4 times multiple as pleasant sounding. They are consonant with the fundamental tone, and odd numbered harmonics, the 3rd and the 5th, as being a little bit at odds with the main tone, and therefore what's called dissonant. Consonant, even harmonics; dissonant, odd harmonics is the way we tend to think about it and talk about it. Your point on tube amps is they're historically older tube designs often had a moderate amount of second harmonic distortion, and a lot of people loved that sound. I would say modern tube amps are fully competitive with solid state amps on the level of distortion. But that's not to say that there aren't classic designs that have a little bit of second harmonic and that just richens up the sound a little bit.
Interesting.
So you have to ask a whole set of questions.
Yeah,
that
I'm
we
like,
won't
then
get
which
into
one
now.
is the
Yeah.
proper recreation? Because if you enjoy what you're hearing, did we actually
Oh, yeah,
add something to it, or is it like?
you're onto a really fundamental thing.
Okay.
So let me just finish with what audiophiles will say on average is that they have learned over time that manipulating the sound to make it better is often a short-term gain for long-term pain. It sounds attractive at first, but then there are different kinds of music where it doesn't work, and so it's be careful is all I would say. Again, this is all about fun. So if you just love second harmonic distortion and in modest amounts, I'd say great, because everything has distortion. All amplifiers have distortion. All speakers have distortion. Everything has distortion. So we're sort of pick your poison isn't the right thing to say, but it's not like we have the choice to have or not have distortion. It's how much, where, of what type, and there certainly could be trade-offs where a little bit of second harmonic distortion is, all things considered, the best
Not bad,
choice
or-
you
yeah.
face,
Okay.
right? We're living in the real world with real equipment on real budgets. And yeah, I've heard, when we go into the history of audio, we'll talk more about tube amps and how wonderful they can be.
Cool.
Okay? So I hope you've enjoyed episode 4 of Audio Basics. Any final thoughts, Lance?
Just please like and subscribe. Hit that bell icon to be notified when our next series or episode drops.
And thank you for watching.
Yep. Thanks. We'll
See you next
week.
time.